Good afternoon, students, faculty, community members. Welcome to the last policy talk of 2018. My name is Jenny. I'm a student of the MPA class of 2019, and it's my pleasure to host this week's policy speaker series with Dr. Warren Mabee. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe, the original keepers of this land, for hosting us today, and for hosting queens each and every day on their land. This acknowledgement reminds us of the responsibility that we have, especially as future policymakers, to listen to the concerns of our Indigenous communities. It is fitting that Dr. Warren Mabee is here to talk to us today about pipelines. This topic has stirred controversy between provinces, governments, Indigenous groups, environmentalists, and economists alike. Warren Mabee holds the Canadian Research Chair in Renewable Energy Development and Implementation. His research focuses on the interface between renewable energy policy and technologies, with particular emphasis on wood energy and biofuels. He has authored numerous studies examining policy for renewable energy options and has provided expert advice to both federal and provincial governments on the development of strategies to reduce our reliance upon fossil fuel energy sources, I should say. Dr. Mabee studied at the University of Toronto, where he received a bachelor's, master's, and PhD from the Faculty of Forestry. He has previously worked for the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, as well as the University of British Columbia. Currently, at Queen's, he teaches with a joint appointment to the School of Policy Studies and the Department of Geography. So, as always, please use Slido to ask questions using the hashtag MPA19. People watching through the live stream, you can also participate. If you don't have a question, that's fine. You can just vote on other questions that are of interest to you. As in the past, we will pose questions at the end with the most votes. We will also ask a few questions live from the crowd. So, please join me now in welcoming Dr. Mabee.
Thank you very much. All right. There we go. So thanks very much. It's great to be here in policy studies. I'm delighted to see so many people out, many of whom are members of my Geography 319 class. So thanks very much for coming along. This is all on the exam, so it's all important info. I want to talk about the kind of current status of energy policy in Canada. We called it Mission Impossible because it has been so hard to come up with any kind of a cohesive vision for energy policy in this country, and we're going to delve into that today and try to understand a little bit more of why that is. So, what do people think of when we think about energy policy? I actually didn't know the answer to this question. I thought, well, what do people think of when they think of energy policy? So I found this nice little tool to do a word cloud, and not surprisingly, the word that pops up right in the middle is oil, energy, power, gas, Alberta. Those are the things that people think of when they think about energy policy in this country. And when you look at what's been going on around the world, it's not, maybe not strange that people think that way, because the world's energy supply is hugely dominated by fossil fuels. The red Pac-Man up on your screen is basically all of the fossil energy that we rely on. Green is bioenergy, orange or gold is nuclear, a little bit of hydro, a little bit of other renewables out there. The world right now is sitting at about 13.5–14% renewables. A slice of nuclear, about 5%, and the rest is fossil fuels. So it's not unusual that people would think of oil first, and gas, and maybe coal when they start talking about energy, because that is, in fact, what we deal with worldwide. The use of renewables is going up around the world by about 2% per year, but the IEA, International Energy Agency, just put out a report basically confirming that renewables still sits at only about 1% of the energy mix, and by renewables, I'm really talking about the emerging renewables, solar, wind, a little bit of geothermal. Canada looks a little bit different, and my class will have seen this before, so apologies to them, but we've got a huge slice of hydropower. About 12% of our energy is hydro. We've got a fairly large slice of nuclear, about 10% is nuclear, a little bit of biomass, a little bit of the other renewables, but we still are dominated by fossil energy in this country, and particularly by oil down at the bottom and natural gas up at the top. We use natural gas for heat. We use oil for transport. There's a little bit of bleed across those two sectors, but not a lot. We don't use that much coal anymore, and that's the one thing that we've done really well, is we've stepped away from coal-fired power. We still use coal-fired energy in other sectors. And of course, we were blessed with Niagara Falls, and we were blessed with lots of rivers and hills and places where we could do hydro. That is why we call electricity hydro. You know, most countries just call it electricity. For us, it is mostly hydropower that we're dealing with. Our use of renewables is going up fairly fast, about 3.8%. It's the fastest growing energy sector in the country, but it is going up relatively slowly because renewables is such a tiny little slice of the entire pie. Canada's got a lot of geopolitics going on when it comes to energy because the energy resources are not evenly distributed across the country. Alberta sits here, by far the largest energy producer in the country, dwarfing virtually every other province. Alberta's energy production is virtually all non-renewable, fossil-based. By comparison, Ontario and Quebec sit here with very green-looking portfolios. In Ontario, we've got a lot of nuclear. We basically have most of the nuclear in the country. Quebec, of course, has lots and lots of hydro. And this makes for schizophrenic policy because you have provinces that, due to geography, I have to say geography is part of my job, that due to geography pick one option. We have provinces that, due to geography, pick something else. And so you can imagine that when the Prime Minister pulls these premiers into the room to talk about energy policy, they all have a different vision because none of these pies look exactly the same. There's a lot of variability from province to province. And energy policy, because of long accidents of history, are primarily a provincial responsibility. And I'm not going to go into that. You have to take 880, Geography 880, if you want to learn more about the history of Canadian energy policy. The other big thing to remember is that we export a lot of that energy, and we export about 4.5 exajoules a year. That translates into X many millions of barrels of oil and so many billion cubic meters of natural gas. Our exports are dominated by fossil exports, and this is the big concern going forward. We don't export much electricity. Most of this electricity comes out of Quebec and actually out of Newfoundland and Labrador through Quebec. As the world starts to pivot away from fossil fuels, and as cheaper sources of fossil fuels come available in different parts of the world, including the States, these exports are really under fire. And we're seeing it. We see it all the time in the press today. Right now, 17% of our GDP in Canada comes from natural resources, both renewable and non-renewable. About 7% is from energy. About 1.5% to 2% of our GDP comes from the oil sands. Just to give people a sense of what the numbers are, where the actual money is coming from. About 3.5% are mines and minerals, 1% is forests, and there's 5% which is indirect. Those are all of the additional jobs, the indirect jobs that go along with the energy sector. So you can think of pipe fitters, electricians, plumbers, all those people that are drawing their incomes basically from the energy sector. We have a big problem right now in that our oil is trading at a huge discount. And maybe you've heard this if you're listening to the news or reading the paper. The benchmark for Canadian oil is Western Canadian Select, and that is a heavy oil, a diluted bitumen that we're sending mostly down into the States. At one point, it was trading for about $14 a barrel. West Texas Intermediate, WTI, which is kind of the North American standard, is trading for about $50 a barrel. So the discount has been significant for Canadian oil. Canadian oil producers are convinced that this is because we don't have enough pipeline space. That if we had more pipeline space, we could get more into the market and people would be willing to offer more, which doesn't seem to really make sense. Because if we flood the market with more product, you would think that the price would just go down. However, this is not what the producers say. They think that we need more space. The big challenges that we're dealing with, a global energy supply that's dominated by fossil fuels. We have increasing energy use in this country driven by population growth and economic growth. We have an energy sector that's dominated by oil and gas, and our exports are dominated by oil and gas, which is probably more important. And because of that, our economy would take a big hit if we pivoted completely to renewables. We would lose a big bit of income, and we'd have to make that up. But our oil isn't really picking up that tab anymore. It's trading at a discount, and people are concerned. So where's the political eye? You know, what are people concerned about? Where are people focused? Right now, this just came out November 22nd, a deafening silence from Trudeau on solving Canada's oil price crisis. The companies and politicians in Alberta are accusing Trudeau of dragging his feet on getting more pipeline capacity. This despite the fact that the Canadian government bought a pipeline, you know, in order to stop that project from collapsing. We've got Canadian oil sands players calling for government-mandated production cuts, which I found shocking to hear private industry in Alberta, of all places, demanding that the government step in and mandate that they do less. Because they could see that reducing the supply might actually lead to a bounce in prices and a kind of increase in the value of that Western Canadian Select. Energy CEOs are at their wits' end in Canada amid pipeline woes. Nobody knows what to do right now, given the fact that no new pipelines are being built. There are projects on the go, but nobody's building right now. In fact, you have the Premier of Alberta promising to buy more rail cars to move oil from Alberta into the States. It will take about a year to get those rail cars delivered and to start moving things, but this is one way that they think that they can move more product. This is our oil pipeline network. There's a few dotted lines. One of them is the Northern Gateway project, which has been killed. It was killed by the Liberals when they moved into power a couple of years ago. There's the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which the Liberals bought. So we own the Trans Mountain Pipeline. It should probably be renamed. There's the Keystone XL project, which up until a few weeks ago was going great guns. And then a district court in the US ordered a stop work because of environmental concerns. And many people point to President Trump's railroading of environmental issues as leading to this kind of problem. We also had looked to build a pipeline across the country using an existing natural gas pipeline, the Energy East pipe that would have taken oil all the way to St. John, New Brunswick. This pipeline died for various political reasons. It was the most complex project, I think, that had ever been proposed in Canada in terms of complexity, in terms of the number of governments that were involved. Bigger than building the railroads, really, when you think about it. Multiple provinces, many communities, many Indigenous groups, First Nations, were involved in the discussions around that, and it really became too complicated to go. Plus, there were a lot of process issues, including Jean Charest having a few words behind closed doors when he shouldn't have, which led to this particular project being canceled. Don't kid yourself, we're facing a Made in Canada energy crisis. Made in Canada because we have dragged our feet, apparently, on building these new pipelines and putting new pipeline capacity in place. If we were a more energy-friendly country, perhaps these pipelines would have been built and the oil sector would be stronger, is the way that the argument goes. But there's a reason that a lot of Canadians have pushed back on this issue. You know, there are underlying causes that are important. We're hemmed in, so Canada is now out of the top 10 energy destinations for the first time in decades. That means destinations for capital. It means that money is no longer flowing into Alberta and into the rest of Canada the way that it once was, largely because these big energy producers see cheaper opportunities elsewhere. It has less to do, I think, with pipelines and more to do with the fact that technologies are changing and demand is changing. So right now, if you were to break down where we are with energy policy in this country, I would say that virtually every politician has their eye on oil. And very few politicians are talking about other forms of energy and the need for an integrated strategy. Some are, but not many. Most people are talking about the need for us to be able to ship more oil, and so pipelines have become the key critical issue. Although we've bought this pipeline of our own, we are still facing a lot of delays, and the pipeline challenge is going to get bigger and bigger for the oil sector. I would say that the short and the midterm threats to employment is one of the three big issues that the government's going to face going into the next election. So it's almost a referendum on oil, a referendum on energy that we're facing right now. So what are the other issues? Well, the big ones are climate and manufacturing, which are summed up nicely in my friend Doug's state here. He wants to blame the carbon tax on for the closure of the GM plant in Oshawa. Never mind that the carbon tax is not in place. Never mind that he's already done things to try to step back from that should have convinced GM, if carbon was the only issue, to stay in the province. Despite the fact that GM has said that the reason that they're shutting this plant is that they want to move to cleaner vehicles and new technologies that maybe Ontario has not been promoting to the extent that they could. This is what Doug has made his mission. And you can expect that those two issues are also going to dominate the next election. Carbon pricing and manufacturing. And I will talk about carbon pricing. I'll talk less about manufacturing as we go forward. The Ontario government unveiled its climate strategy yesterday. Amazingly, its carbon strategy is going to be much cheaper than the carbon strategies that have been promoted by other governments. The core of this is that the government will create an account, $400 to $800 million, that companies will be able to bid for in order to introduce carbon-reducing technologies. And those companies will also be set a cap, similar to the cap-and-trade system, and if they exceed that cap, they'll have to pay some kind of penalty, but we don't know how much, and we don't know where the caps will sit yet. And we don't really know how this is all going to be paid for, except that it will be the taxpayers that pay for it. The advantage of the cap-and-trade program was that industry was paying for it, of course passing it on to taxpayers, but industry was taking it on the chin. Now taxpayers will take it on the chin. Climate change, I'm not going to say too much about climate change other than to say that the critical impacts that we're facing that are linked to the use of fossil fuels include virtually everything in terms of our productivity across the country, the biodiversity that we have, the natural capital that we have to utilize. It's going to cost us a lot of money. Everybody agrees that increased insurance payouts and hits to the GDP are what we can expect as basically weather gets weirder and as it becomes less predictable under a warming climate. And I don't need to say more than that because that's enough of an argument for us to be taking it very seriously. So carbon pricing, which is a climate debate or a referendum on climate policy, and manufacturing, which is the future economy, where we're going to go. Those are the other two big issues that I think are coming. And I think that any energy policy that we write is a de facto environmental policy because they're all have to do with how much oil, how much gas we're going to be using, how we're going to use it, how efficiently we're going to use it going forward. Prime Minister Trudeau set up a grand bargain when he entered into office He's essentially said that we would have tighter and tighter regulation on the fossil sector, including carbon pricing, but that he would also support the expansion of that sector and the important jobs and economic development that goes along with it. So carbon pricing and growth in the fossil sector, that's a pretty hard thing to achieve because they really run counter to each other, and many, many, many Canadians have asked how this could be, how you can do both. There may be ways to do both, to some extent, but it's a very tricky sell, and it's going to be a problem coming into the next election. Energy and environmental policy has to take on a number of forms in order to be able to address these issues. So let's talk about what kind of directions they might take. So here's the challenge. Here's our emissions. According to Environment Canada, we sat at 704 megatons, million tons of CO2 equivalent in 2016. Now, it's interesting because I used to have a different number there, and the government seems to have sort of rejigged those numbers over recent years. Now our emissions have sort of flattened out, whereas before they were on the rise. Some of that is accounting, some of that is modeling. It's difficult to say exactly how things have been tweaked, but the number is definitely lower. It breaks down roughly into these categories, and some of these categories are going up. So oil and gas emissions are going up, and by far, they're the biggest sort of impact that we're seeing. Heavy-duty transport is going up. Buildings are going up. Industry is going up. And other transport, which includes aviation, are going up. There are a few things that are coming down. Light-duty transport emissions are coming down, and electricity emissions are coming down. And it's not surprising that almost all of the environmental and energy policies that we've written over the last 15 years have focused on electricity, and they've focused on gas-powered vehicles, trying to find alternative fuels and battery-powered sort of options for those light-duty vehicles. So policies can work, is the message here. They work, they deliver some value, but we haven't done enough policy because there are all these other sectors where nothing has happened and where, in fact, we're seeing big increases in the emissions and problems in the future. The emission trend, well, like I say, the emissions sort of have flattened out, but the long-term trend is still going up. The old number that I used to give was 1.1 billion 1.1 billion tons of CO2 equivalent per year by the year 2100. Now I say 1,028 megatons, so it's slightly better than it was. The trend is starting to drop. Not enough to have achieved a negative yet. Remember that Canada is still growing very fast in terms of population, at about 1.2% per year. And at 1.2%, with some years spiking up to almost 1.5%, it doesn't really matter how much better we get on a per capita basis. Our total emissions are still rising. This is how we can address emissions. There are a bunch of tools that we can use. We can eliminate coal, and we're working on that. We can electrify cars. We can put biofuels or maybe use fuel cell vehicles for our heavy-duty trucks. We can do green electricity, which we've been working on. We can do net zero buildings and move towards a lower footprint that way. We can do green agriculture and forestry that will sequester more carbon in the ground. But by far the biggest slice here is conservation. And nothing can happen inside of, or to meet our climate goals, to get towards a zero emission society without strong moves in conservation. We essentially have to get to anywhere from 10% to 20% of our current energy use per capita, and we have to stay there on the long term. We have to keep at a very low rate. It's possible to do with all these other tools, but it's a challenge, and it means that you have to write your energy policy across multiple sectors in order to meet that challenge. But this would take you, ultimately, to virtually zero emissions by the year 2100, And that is what the United Nations is now saying is necessary in order to stave off long-term climate disaster, if it's not already too late to achieve that. So eliminating coal. Eliminating coal is actually something that we've done a lot on. Ottawa has introduced plans to phase out coal-fired electricity. Ottawa has worked with provinces to accelerate the phase-out. We've heard from the province of Alberta that they are willing to do that and that they have a 2030 target now to phase out their overall coal-fed electricity use. We also have provinces like Saskatchewan that have not said that they will phase out coal and in fact are doubling down and saying that they would like to continue with that economy with carbon capture and sequestration. Maybe that can work and maybe it can't. It's a tricky thing to see. Only about half of the electricity or half of the coal that we're using goes into electricity. The other half goes into heavy industry, including cement production. Any place you need a very energy-dense fuel. And in fact, we don't have very many alternatives in those sectors, and nobody is really talking about phasing that out. There's also metallurgical coal, the coal that goes to steel making, and we don't have any real plans to phase that out either. And that is a problem going forward, but we can phase out some. We can electrify cars. There are lots of incentives in place in Canada. Until recently, Ontario had a fairly strong incentive for electric cars. Premier Ford decided to phase that incentive out, but what they did announce yesterday in their climate plan is that they're going to find ways to expand the charging network in order to make it easier to drive an electric vehicle, because there will be more places to charge your vehicle in order to keep going on the road. In Quebec and in BC, you can still get money rebates to help buy a vehicle, which can help because these vehicles don't always fall perfectly in line with the price of a regular average vehicle. All vehicles are getting more expensive, and in fact, introducing electric vehicles may accelerate the push towards less car ownership and more car sharing programs and ride sharing programs where cars become more of a service rather than an appliance. You're going to rent your time in a car rather than buy it. Biofuels in trucks. I particularly like biofuels in trucks because I've worked a lot on biofuels over the years. For a while, we really expanded biofuel use in the country. Through the early 2000s towards about 2010, we basically quadrupled or quintupled production of biofuels, particularly ethanol, which was to go into light-duty vehicles. Biodiesel production, which is the lighter colored line, the orange line here, has not grown by nearly as much. People in my class will know that part of the reason for that is that it's a terrible business plan. It doesn't really pay for itself the way that corn to ethanol or other forms of ethanol did. We can build the capacity is what this graph is meant to show. It is possible for us to do this. There is more than enough feedstock out there to drive a biofuel-driven future for heavy-duty transport. But we can't have heavy-duty transport continuing to develop at the same pace that is developed until now. Right now, heavy-duty emissions are going up faster than virtually anything else in the country. And the reason for that is increasingly the Walmart effect and the Amazon effect, the fact that we have fewer warehouses and we have rolling warehouses on the highway, the fact that people are buying more and more things, and too many people are pressing the expedite purchase, the overnight delivery option, which drives your emissions up by a factor of 1/3 to half, because now they're forced to throw your stuff into the next available truck, which may or may not be full, which may or may not have been going where you live. So you can really, really increase your carbon footprint by choosing to accelerate your deliveries. So don't do that. We can swap out a lot of those fuels, and we can do a lot better than we do right now. Long term, we need people to do less of that kind of shopping, and that is a societal change that we need to go through. We're working on a clean fuel standard. It's now moving, towards regulation. This is actually probably the most important policy to drive us towards a cleaner transport sector, because by putting greenhouse gas emission reduction targets onto the fuels, rather than simply saying that we need 10% ethanol or 5% biodiesel, by saying we actually want to see the footprint go down, you can really accelerate the change in overall emissions. So the clean fuel standard, I think, is actually, it's underappreciated, but it's a very powerful policy to get us towards that zero emission goal, as long as it's applied steadily. You can't just set a simple target and then once you get there, have it stop. It needs to continue to ratchet down and continue to be applied steadily through the next century, basically. So the clean fuel standard, it augments what we already have, which is a renewable fuel standard, but it's a much more powerful tool in terms of bringing down emissions over time. Conservation, this is by far the big one. Without conservation, we're not going to get to our goals. In fact, without conservation, emissions still go up. We set them back a little bit, but the overall trend is still angled up. And with conservation, the best possible tool is probably carbon pricing, because carbon pricing is a signal that tells you, whoops, what I'm doing has a footprint, and maybe there's another alternative that I could follow that would have a lower footprint. I'm not the world's biggest fan of carbon pricing. I think that carbon pricing as a panacea, as a single silver bullet solution, doesn't work very well. But as a tool to get people to start changing behaviors, it's been shown time and again to be effective. To be continually effective, it's got to continue to rise. So you've got to have governments that are willing to stick with that and to drive that forward. We did have kind of a nice setup in Canada where BC and Alberta had put in a carbon tax, or a carbon levy, as they called it in Alberta, where Ontario and Quebec had actually gone in with California on a cap and trade system, which basically allowed industry to trade credits and move money back and forth while they're bringing their emissions down. Right now, we actually have a situation where Ontario has stepped out of cap and trade and has said they're going to fight the carbon pricing. Manitoba has stepped away from their plans for carbon pricing and now wants to fight. Saskatchewan has always wanted to fight. And Alberta probably will want to fight, depending on what happens in their next election. Premier Notley will keep a tax. She may not raise it, but she'll keep it. Premier Kenney, if he were ever elected, very likely would not, because it's not part of the Conservative brand anymore. So the bloc is splintered, and more governments in Canada are lining up against the Prime Minister on this issue. Now, the thing that may save the Prime Minister is that he has started to transform his carbon tax program into what's really a tax and dividend system, where he will take the money in and then he will redistribute it to individual Canadians, to homeowners, to voters. And by doing that, by putting the money back in taxpayers' pockets, he may win them over. We will see if it is enough. We will see if it is enough for them to be able to survive the election and to be able to implement the tool to the extent that it needs to be implemented. And by the way, the tax and dividend, or cap and dividend system, was the Conservatives' preferred policy up until the Liberals decided that they were going to do it. So this is my biggest concern going forward, or one of my biggest concerns, is that the carbon tax is what's necessary, and it's one of the only programs that really is driving a broader culture of conservation. We don't have any other similar programs. There's a lot of very small, dedicated, niche programs designed to get you conserving, but only a carbon price was there to help you think about your footprint in all aspects of your life. And without that, we've got a big problem in meeting any kind of future goals. Green electricity, actually, virtually every province has got some kind of a strategy to green their electricity supply. The lovely thing is that the technologies have become cheap enough that even when you want to be friendly to coal, the utilities probably won't choose it. And President Trump is experiencing this in the States now. You know, he was elected with this idea that he would bring back coal and reopen some of these coal-powered facilities. The utilities don't want to do it because it's actually more expensive than the renewables that they can generate. The big problem that we have right now with our electricity mix is that we have too many non-dispatchable sources. Dispatchable power is power that you can turn on when you need it and turn off when you don't. You can't do that with nuclear, which is always on. And you can't do that with most of the renewables because they're either on or off depending on whether the sun is shining or the wind is blowing or both. We need energy storage in the mix, and the easiest way to do that is through hydro reservoirs. Quebec is well situated geographically to be able to do that. Most provinces are not. Ontario is not. We don't have big hydro reservoirs that we control where we can store power. You would think with Niagara Falls and the St. Lawrence River that it'd be easy, but of course we share jurisdiction with the states, and those are navigable waterways, so we can't just decide to dam up the St. Lawrence for a week while we have an abundance of power and then let the water all out and go when we need it. It's all controlled. But we're thinking very strongly about it. As I say, emissions are coming down in electricity, and we have a lot of technologies to deal with this. So I think this is the one that's probably moving forward the best. Of course, in Ontario, we're now going through some pain because we have a Conservative government that's decided to cancel a lot of projects that had been announced. This might not be a bad thing. As I say, Ontario invested a lot in renewable power over the last 10 years. Not all of those investments were brilliant investments. We ended up with some power that we can't really use effectively because of the lack of storage. And a good strategy for Ontario would be to now go back to the design board and think about how we could get more storage into the system to take advantage of those technologies that we've put in play. Lots of new technologies. Net zero buildings, I'm nearly done. We're almost at the end. There are lots of ways that we could build net zero buildings. There's two parts to building a net zero building. One is that the building itself has to be well insulated, should probably generate some power so that you can offset any draw off the grid, should have other green technologies, water recycling and things like that. The other thing is that it should not use a lot of embodied energy, and this is actually a big problem for us in Canada. Most of the buildings that we build are very energy intensive because we are shifting more and more to multi-story, multi-unit dwellings, condo towers. Those are almost all concrete slab construction, you know, where you build with concrete. Concrete has a huge embodied energy footprint because concrete is made by melting rock, and melting rock requires a lot of power. And we have done some work here at Queen's, and there's people here, I see Andrew, who have worked on reducing the footprint that goes along with concrete production and cement production. That's one way to reduce that embodied energy piece. We need more research. Using more biomass in construction, so building tall buildings with wood is another way to do it. In Kingston, we're a little bit gun shy because of the big fire on Princess Street a few years ago, with a wood frame building. However, building a tall building with greener concrete, greener cement, and with a lot of biomass can reduce the embodied energy by a factor of 5. So if we want to really produce net zero buildings and green buildings, this is the way to go forward. This is Brock Commons at UBC. That's a residence, which is a tall wooden building. We like to try these things with students first, just in case there's a problem. So yeah, we need it in both single-family homes. Actually, we've got a lot of good demonstrations of net zero single-family homes, but increasingly we need it for multi-story buildings. So this is a place where Canada could really shine, because moving towards that greener form of construction not only offsets a lot of energy up front, but it helps with all those other conservation goals. And so it becomes an important strategy. And then the last piece is green agriculture and forestry. We're increasingly aware that the way that we manage both our farms and our forests has a negative net impact if it's done badly. And industrial farming is one of the things that actually can drive those impacts up, because it requires a lot of tilling, it requires a lot of chemical fertilizer application. Those are high energy and high CO2 footprints. We need it in order to feed people, but there are also practices that we can bring in. And this is an example. This is no-till type agriculture that can help improve those practices. We know that if we improve both forestry and agriculture, we can start to sequester carbon. And sequestering carbon is really where we want to get to long term, because it's not enough just to eliminate emissions. Eventually, we have to start drawing emissions out of the atmosphere and putting it back into presumably the ground, or it could be our buildings or our consumer goods, but it's got to be out of the atmosphere in order to actually get past the hurdles that we face. So there is some progress there, but there's a lot of potential problems. So where does all this leave us? Well, we've got an action plan with kind of 7 components. We've got about a C- on eliminating coal. Some provinces have done well. Ontario did a very good job of eliminating coal over a relatively short period of time. Some provinces are pushing back. And so we're not at a B yet. We're certainly not in an A. We're about at a C with electric cars. We were doing a little bit better, but Ontario stepping away from providing any support for purchases hurts us. Expanding the charging networks, that will help. I think we're at about a C with the clean fuel standard and the biofuel idea. We're putting the right policies in place, but nobody knows exactly how fast they're going to work yet. And it's the speed at which those standards are applied that really will prove whether or not the policies are going to work. I think we're at a D- on conservation. I'd like to put an F almost, but we have a federal government that is still committed, despite all the opposition, to moving a carbon price forward. And once it's in, I think that grade goes up. But until it's actually effective and running, I think we have to stay here. The movement lately against the carbon policy and the fact that premiers across the country are lining up to battle Ottawa on this, I think is problematic. Green electricity, I think we got a B+. It's not quite an A. If I could get Saskatchewan building something, then I'd be happier. Net zero homes, I think we're at an F. Because despite some small changes to the building code to allow slightly taller buildings, despite some good demonstrations, we're not seeing any aggressive motion there. And in fact, the housing market is fraught with a whole lot of other concerns around affordability, around the price for new homeowners. Nobody wants to talk about adding additional costs to the price of a house. And I understand that, it's expensive, but at the same time, an investment today pays off for the next 100 years. And they need to be amortized over that period. We can't wait 50 years and then decide to put these things into play. It's got to start now. And then there's about a D on the green agriculture and forestry. We know the practices that will help. There needs to be a bigger investment in putting them into play. And so overall, it's about a D+. Not failing, but they have to come see me after class. So, the takeaway. Creating a big energy policy for Canada, is it mission impossible? It's not really, but it's not really creating one policy either. It's creating a suite of policies that's going to work together. To give props where they're due, the Harper government did a good job in combining a lot of disparate programs into one umbrella, and that was the Eco-Energy Program. I thought it was a good move at the time because it took programs that were under different ministries and running on different timelines and put them into the same office, essentially, allowed for a little bit more of a comprehensive view. We can do the same thing again, but it needs to be much broader than just electricity production or just fuels. It's basically everything. And that's the challenge with energy policy. It's everything. We've got to cover the whole gamut. The most challenging issues are buildings and conservation. It's where we live and how we live. and we don't have the right policies in place to deal with those. We may have the beginnings of something with a carbon price. We don't really have it for the construction side of things. We need to consider this going forward because these are the long-term investments, not the short-term investments. This is what pays off over 100 years, not over a year. We need to figure out how to do that. Carbon prices, they directly impact energy. And of course, you're hearing all the time about how carbon pricing is what's driving our problems in the oil patch. Well, it's not really. Actually, what's driving our problems in the oil patch is that we have very expensive oil, and oil that's landlocked and difficult to move around. Carbon pricing might accelerate things, but it's not the one thing that's affecting the downturn there. But bringing in a carbon price is going to have a very, very significant impact over the long term, really on our behaviors and how we do things. Have the Conservatives figured it out? I don't think so. I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. Let's see how their policy works. But so far, I'm not seeing a lot. And then finally, with the greener and cleaner fuels, well, what can we do to accelerate the sector? We've done a lot. We've made a lot of progress, but we focus mostly on electricity and a bit on fuels. We actually have to go much broader in our strategies going forward. So there's a big role for us in the universities to help move that forward. And that's it. Oops, that's really it. I'll just say thank you to my team and thank you to my class for coming. And I'm happy to open it up now to questions.
Thank you so much. So our first, do you want to read the question? Or?
You can read the question.
Okay, I'll read the
question. I can't see them properly from here.
So if most of the conservation needs to be done at the industry level, why are consumers the ones who are always being blamed?
I hear this a lot. People sort of think of corporations like they're other people, like our neighbor, Coca-Cola, who lives down the road, who is creating a lot of problems. Well, we're the ones who buy Coca-Cola, so the corporation exists to serve us. Absolutely, we should be charging the corporations for their footprint, and some are better and some are worse. They will pass the price along to us. Absolutely they will, because that's just part of the cost of doing business now. It is something that needs to be shared among all the parties that are out there. Corporations do sometimes have deep pockets, and they can afford to make changes that an average citizen, an average taxpayer can't afford to do. Corporations also are the groups that need to introduce some of the new technologies, because we're going to be driving that as we go forward. We need the new cars, we need the new computers, we need the new tools to be able to live in this lower carbon economy. So I think that you need to do both, but really consumers are the ones buying the things in the end, and the cost will come to us. So I think that that's the way to look at it.
So why is Ottawa so hesitant to invest on renewable energy?
I think Ottawa would argue that they have done a lot to invest in renewables over the years. There are billions of dollars that have been put into the renewable economy, and hopefully billions more to come. Part of the challenge is in the split between federal and provincial jurisdictions, right? So the federal government doesn't get too involved in electricity generation, for instance. They've provided some support mechanisms, but generally those are supporting provincial activities rather than a national sort of an initiative. They do have a bigger role to play in fuels, because fuels actually move around, they cross borders, and there are pipelines and those types of technologies. Ottawa also has really embraced the industry lead, industry first sort of model. So they've tried to create conditions that will lead to better technology development. It hasn't always worked out. I think that they could do more direct investment, but it'd be nice to have the provinces partnering in that, and we haven't seen that as much.
I see a question at the back, so we'll take one from the floor.
Yeah.
The Orange Livermore Labs every year does an audit of U.S. energy consumption and production.
Yeah.
And they show that 2/3 of all energy from 2/3 of our, so electric cars are going to be powered by generation that wasted already 2/3 of the energy.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't we have efficiencies up on this as, the other nice thing in that report was residential homes are the most efficient consumers of energy.
Yeah.
Wasting only about 10% of their energy.
Yeah.
Compared to everything else which wastes 2/3.
Yeah. So this is absolutely true. An average thermal plant in the US, you can think of coal-fired or natural gas-fired electricity, is typically only about 30% efficient. So 2/3 of the energy is being lost, typically in the form of heat. Houses do better because we had a lot of building programs in the 70s and the 80s designed to accelerate the building code, improve insulation, all those different aspects which reduce that footprint. The better forms of electricity production are much more efficient. So you can build a combined cycle gas plant now that will be close to 80% efficient. They'll lose about 20% of the heat, but the rest is being captured. You can make it even more efficient if you can connect to some kind of a district energy system or an institution that will use some of that heat. Shouldn't be Queens though, because I think Queens loses a big portion of the heat. If the ground lines, that follow the steam lines are anything to go by. Yeah, saving heat is probably the most important thing that you can do. The trouble, of course, is that we have very hot summers, and so what do you do with heat during the summer? It's a challenge. There are some methods of storing heat underground that we're pursuing. They're expensive. There are ways of turning that heat into energy, kind of a third cycle system that will generate some power off of that. Again, they're a little bit challenging. As we go away from combustion as the primary way of generating electricity, as we move towards solar panels and things like that, the losses should go down. And so I totally agree. There are ways or issues, but there are ways to avoid those issues. Yeah. Yes.
All right. So, excuse me. Do you think the reason Canada is moving toward green energy? Do you think the reason Canada is moving toward green energy because it's a world leader in not emissions, since Canada only makes up 1.6% of world emissions?
Yeah. So it's a great point. Canada is a very small footprint in the overall world, right? We have anywhere from 1.5% to 2% of emissions, depending on who you believe, which stats you believe. We have about 0.5% of the world's population. So our footprint per capita is pretty bad. Not the worst in the world, but pretty close. Why should we move more towards renewables? Well, for one thing, it's not just about moving us to renewables, it's about moving our economy off of non-renewables. And if the whole world decides to go to non-renewables, and there's a lot of indication that the major countries are going in that direction, then we have an economy that could be stranded. Because we rely fairly heavily, as I showed at the beginning, on oil and gas as a way to generate GDP. It's a big part of our trade portfolio. It's a big part of the overall GDP that we enjoy. So investing in renewables and figuring out how to get our economy off of fossil fuels, I think is probably a good idea, a strategically smart idea. The other thing is I think we have a moral obligation to do it. We are one of the richest countries in the world. It may not feel like it to everybody in the room, but we are. We are one of the most technologically advanced countries in the world. We are certainly one of the countries in the world that has the most resources, the most opportunity to do this transformation. We can lead the way. We can show people how it's done. We can be a pilot, to show people how to navigate their way through this transition. We can help other countries to achieve these types of goals, and we will profit from that to some extent, but I think more and more it's the moral obligation. How can we expect other countries to clean up their act if we're not willing to do it ourselves, and if we can't take advantage of all that's already here in order to do that? So that's my take on that particular question.
Thank you. And we had another question from the floor here.
Yeah.
So my question is that if there is evidence, if there is evidence that Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Perfect. So there's evidence that, carbon tax does reduce emissions. And why is it that the Conservative government in Ontario thinks otherwise? And what justification do they use to prove this otherwise?
So actually, I've never heard the Conservative government say that they outright don't believe that a carbon tax would reduce emissions. Maybe they have said it, I've never seen it said or seen it written down. What I have heard them say is that, we already pay enough tax. That's the line that Doug Ford uses, that we've already taken a lot of the load, that paying more is unconscionable, that we shouldn't have to do that. I think it's not really a question of would it help reduce emissions, it's more a question of how much can the taxpayer withstand. There's also good evidence that, carbon taxes help people make changes to their lives and reduce emissions, but that those changes can be fleeting if the tax doesn't continue to progress, meaning if it doesn't get higher and higher. And I think that's the biggest flaw with a carbon tax. That's the biggest problem with a carbon tax, is that there are very few governments that are willing to promise that they're going to elevate the carbon tax by, let's say, $10 per ton per year, which is what the federal Liberals have promised to do over a 50-year period. First off, no government can make that promise because they're not in power that long. Secondly, it's kind of political suicide to promise people that you're going to charge them more and more going forward. Regulation is the other way to get at this issue, but it's hard to regulate behaviors. Most of what I've talked about can be done with a regulation. You can regulate greener electricity, you can regulate greener buildings, you can regulate cleaner trucks. But what you can't regulate is consumer behavior, and you can't regulate the way that people lead their lives day to day. You can incentivize change, and that's where a carbon price can really help. I actually don't think you need to charge that much in order to get people thinking about it, because what we're talking about charging right now, $20 a ton, it's almost unnoticeable, on an average Ontarian's monthly bills. What you would pay for gasoline would go up a little bit. What you would pay for natural gas would go up a little bit. But it's not so much that suddenly your household budget will be thrown into disarray. Most people can absorb that. It's just the thought of paying it that's driving everybody nuts. And that's what's going to change behaviors, is if they think that they're going to pay something but they could avoid it. So it's a rambling answer, but I think it's an important tool. It's certainly not the be-all and end-all, and it's certainly not going to solve all our problems. I think Paul's got a question too.
Oh, okay, sure.
I'd like to follow up on that. So it was a great talk, Byron, and you really brought out how important conservation is in terms of reaching those emissions. And really, most of what you said, apart from the last minute or so, was about carbon tax as a way of implementing that conservation. Why is it that we can't just accept the fact that carbon is causing a problem, fossil fuels are causing a problem, and change our behavior without a stick, as it were?
Well, I think because it's so ingrained. It's built into all of our infrastructure, right? And the mind-boggling transformation that has to happen when you start to think that there are, I can't remember the exact number right now. I think it's 8 million single-family homes or 15 million single-family homes across the country. Another so many million multi-story dwellings, all heated usually with some kind of individual heater system or building heater system. So there's millions of points of emission just associated with our buildings. There are millions of vehicles, more points of emission. There are big power plants. There are lots of places where we've got carbon emissions going on. And so eliminating those all just seems too terrifying for most people to contemplate. Technology is helping, and I think that if we did nothing, technology eventually would get us to the zero carbon footprint, but it might take 300 years. And the society might not last that long if we run into very significant climate change issues. Because if we disrupt farming, if we disrupt water supplies, if we disrupt energy production, because of this change, we're not going to have a viable working economy to be able to do these things, and things will rapidly deteriorate. So there's a real need to start moving ahead. I think we need a combination of incentives and sticks. That's really where I want to get to. Like, there are a lot of things we can do by regulating, but we still need some incentive to get people to move a bit quicker. And carbon tax is not the only one. There are other tools that are out there. Carbon tax so far has been the most all-encompassing, holistic tool that we've talked about. It may not be the best one, and I encourage people to think about alternatives because we're going to need them, but it certainly is, it's a good one. Thanks, Paul.
So we'll take one more question. Can you explain why the industry thinks that more pipeline capacity will raise prices?
So the argument right now is that because there's a limited supply going into the States, and because everything is bottlenecked, that we've become price takers rather than price setters. That basically, you know, there's a limited supply, and industry is saying, well, it's difficult to work with this, so I'll give you 10 bucks a barrel, 15 bucks a barrel, whatever the number is, and that's going to be the value that I've set for your product. If there were more pipes to more places, if more refineries could be engaged, if there weren't these choke points, you know, within the system, maybe we could find somebody else who'd be willing to pay 20 bucks, and then maybe 22 bucks, and we could keep pushing the price up. Pipelines also can get your product into other countries, and that's probably the more important thing. If we start to build more pipes to the coast, that means that we're going to start to access new economies, you know, that we haven't been able to get our oil to in the past, and we might be able to find countries willing to give us a better price. It's a little bit of a wishful thinking model, though, because it's a difficult oil to process, the heavy bitumen oil that we are selling. And there's a glut of oil on the world market right now. OPEC is ramping back their production, the big petroleum producers. The US is accelerating their production under President Trump. Nobody knows how sustainable any of that is. I mean, ultimately, none of it is truly sustainable. But right now, we're left in a real bind. We don't have big markets to go to. And I don't think adding the new capacity is going to necessarily address that price, but right now our producers are desperate, and they've latched onto this as the solution. And that's really what's happened.
All right, well, that concludes the time we have today. Please join me in thanking Dr. Mabee again.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.